This is ContraZoom, where we go back and forth about film. I'm your host, Dakota Arsenault. We are back counting down the top 50 films of the decade so far. Last week, on part 1 of this series, we revealed films 50 through 26, with plenty of voicemails from friends of the show talking about why they voted for these films. Today, we'll be listing the top 25 films. The format will be the same way. For every film name, there will be someone singing its praises, and every once in a while, I'll pop in to share some interesting facts and stats about the list. On part 1, the statistics were geared more to the full list of films that were on people's ballots, while today I'm going to share ones specific to the top 50. I don't want to spoil things too much too early. In case you didn't listen to part 1, which you should absolutely go back and listen to first, I sent out a survey to as many critics as I could find, asking them to name their 20 favorite films that were released from 2020 to 2024. The film had to be released wide or on streaming services by January 1st, 2020, so anything that had a festival premiere in 2019 was still eligible. The cutoff date was December 13th, 2024, so anything that has come out in the last few weeks was not allowed, despite some voters trying to sneak in a few of those titles on. Films that were ranked first received 20 points, and a film that was ranked 20th received 1 point, and so on. I want to give a huge thank you to everyone who voted and who contributed a voicemail. A full list of contributors will be noted over on ContraZoomPod.com. Let's get to it. Number 25, Nope.
Hi, I'm Callum from the Scared Reducing podcast, here to talk about Nope. Jordan Peele's 2017 critical and commercial hit Get Out thrust him immediately into the horror stratosphere, with his blend of scares and racial satire carving out a unique avenue in cinema, which the comedian turned director very likely could have stayed in without much resistance. That Peele has instead continued to push his stories into bigger and weirder places, all while maintaining their mainstream appeal, is one of Hollywood's greatest triumphs in recent years. All this culminated with Peele's biggest and in my opinion, best featured film to date, Nope. What could easily be a sci-fi horror about a killer alien using the template of Jaws to draw from, Nope is instead an operatic tale about why we feel the need to turn violence into entertainment. Featuring outstanding performances from the likes of Daniel Kaluuya, Keke Palmer and Steven Yeun, and arguably the best day-for-night cinematography ever captured on screen, thanks to the brilliant Hoyt van Hoytema, when you sit down to watch Nope, you're going to witness an absolute spectacle.
Number 24, Poor Things.
Hi, this is Brian Loomis with the What a Picture podcast. I want to talk about one of my favorite movies from the decade, Poor Things. The first thing that stands out about Poor Things is Emma Stone's phenomenal performance. You know, Yorgos Lanthimos is one of my favorite directors of recent years, but Emma Stone absolutely steals the movie out from under him here. She is one of the singular performances, certainly of the decade, and one that I will remember for a long time. Yorgos's movies are always sort of picking apart social conventions and showing how nonsensical they are, particularly around gender, marriage, and family in a lot of his movies. This one's very much focused on gender and the social conventions that we expect women to follow. And he does a really good job picking that apart, and he also does it in such a funny way. I would say that this is probably his funniest movie. It made me laugh out loud in a way that his other films don't necessarily. They're more humorous and, you know, make you chuckle ways, but this one is just conventionally funny and plays so well in a movie theater and visually very striking and stunning as well. Lots of stylistic choices that I think serve to enhance what's going on the screen. So, Poor Things, great movie. Definitely check it out if you haven't seen it.
Number 23, The Substance.
Hi, I'm Brody Cottenham, screenwriter and contributor for the ContraZoom website, and I'm happy to champion one of the best horror movies of the 2020s, director Coralie Farge's The Substance. This incredibly shot film is uncompromising. It's kind of akin to a sort of throwback Cronenberg-style body horror, and it's full of darkly funny satire and social commentary. Both Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley give some of the year's best performances, both as women trying to navigate a patriarchal society. It doesn't know the word subtle, but ultimately it is better off for this. It's gruesome, it's unflinching in how it weaves this narrative premise, and I'm sure by now most of you are familiar with the idea of the story and how this substance creates a quote-unquote better version of yourself. How they use this to hammer home its message is really what makes it so effective, even if it's basically done by brute force. The third act is as unhinged a piece of cinema as I've seen in a very long time, and it's like the most stylish of car crashes. You just can't help but be drawn in, and they bring it together expertly at the end. So it's definitely one of the stronger films of this decade.
Number 22. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse.
Hello, it's Daniel Grant from the Spoiled Rotten podcast. I was selected to talk about Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, the sequel to Into the Spider-Verse. There's a lot of things you could say about this movie that are great. The animation, the score, the soundtrack, the voice cast. But what really stuck with me was the race relations. I think Miles's mother trying to remind him he's not going to be welcome in all the spaces he wants to be a part of. Her desire to protect him that way really spoke to me, and I think it really did show that there's not like you're black or you're white, so there's racism. That there was nuanced racism there between Miguel and Miles as well. The way he tried to offer an olive branch by speaking in Spanish, and the grunt he got back from Miguel. So even within the good guys or the people of color, there was some dissent, and I think that the movie properly explored that and had a character like Hobie who was trying to push like, hey, don't dim your blackness to be a part of this. Obviously it's coded, but I think that it was pretty clear what they were trying to get at. So it made it a great movie on many levels, but I was really into the race relations of it all, and allyship. I know I'm throwing that in there at the last second, but really scrutinizing Gwen's allyship. It was all great stuff for me, and I love the movie.
Number 21, Another Round.
Hey, this is Matthew Simpson from the Awesome Friday podcast, here to talk a little bit about Another Round, a 2020 film starring Mads Mikkelsen, which is about a group of four men whose lives have stagnated and are able to reinvigorate them via the hypothesis that the human body has a persistent 0.05% blood alcohol deficiency. They resolve to fix this deficiency, and their lives are changed forever, but as the experiment persists, they take on more and more chances and risk, and eventually the chickens come home to roost. It's a singular work from director Thomas Vinterberg, an examination of lives not lived and the extents we might go to make change. Mads Mikkelsen gives the performance of his career, and the movie will hit especially hard for anyone who has had to make tough choices about how they approach life and relationships. It's a powerful, melancholy, celebratory, existential film, my personal favorite not only of 2020, but of the 2020s.
Number 20, Anatomy of a Fall.
Hi everybody, it's Alex here. Today I'm going to be praising Justin Triet's 2003 masterpiece, Anatomy of a Fall. The reason I've chosen this movie is because it's one of the most complex and thought-provoking movies that cinema has produced in quite some time. It's just masterfully crafted by Justin Triet, and her Oscar-winning screenplay with Arthur Harari is one of the best written pieces of cinema I've seen. The reason why this movie is so great is because throughout the movie, we are given multiple perspectives of the fall. We are given multiple pieces of evidence. We sit through multiple pieces of pretty life-changing testimony, but at the end of the movie, we still find ourselves questioning, what did we see? Did we see the truth? What actually happened that day? And this is a mark of a really, really great thriller, to make us question, what did we actually witness? And part of what makes this movie so great is the performance of Sandra Hüller. She gives a performance that has multiple layers to it. And throughout the movie, we see multiple sides of her character, both in being a obviously downtrodden and trying to be supportive wife, to honestly just being another person entirely. The scene where she tells her husband, "You are not a victim," not at all, for me, is the best written scene and the best performed scene of the 2020s. Honestly, I really wish this movie had won more Oscars because it is magnificent. Thank you very much.
Number 19, The Banshees of Inisherin.
Hi, it's Brody Cottenham, screenwriter and contributor for the ContraZoom website, and I'm happy to discuss one of my favorite films of the 2020s, Mark McDonagh's The Banshees of Inisherin. This heartfelt, raw, darkly funny, even tragic at times look at the nature of friendship, family dynamics, politics, and yes, even one's beloved pet, comprises everything that makes for a compelling narrative. It's wonderfully shot, incredibly well acted, and expertly scripted. It manages to perfectly balance humor and emotion, and as it unfolds, you really can't help but be drawn in by these wonderfully constructed characters and all their performances. The captivating scenery and the narrative helps weave this often dark tale of old friends drifting apart and lives forever changed. It's one of those films that lingers with you long after each viewing and certainly fully deserving of all the accolades it received. I liked it yesterday and certainly will tomorrow.
Number 18, Anora.
Hey, Dakota, ContraZoom pod. This is Martin Strange from the podcast Filmsplaining with Martin Strange. Pardon my scratchy, hoarse voice. I'm a bit under the weather at the moment, but I did want to dial in and let you know about my favorite film of the year and possibly of the decade so far, which is Sean Baker's Anora. I was just completely knocked out by this movie from beginning to end. I think it's one of the funniest films I've seen in years. It's one of the most heartfelt, most true portraits of modern America that I've seen in many years. Sean Baker makes these movies about marginalized people, and I think this is his masterpiece in that regard. It contains a stunning, just knockout performance from Mikey Madison. I think she's doing things here that are just unbelievable, the things she's asked to do, and carries this movie. It's never slow, it's never boring. It's always exciting and interesting and entertaining, and you really, really feel for these people. You get so invested in their whole situation and the things that happen around them and the decisions that are made that lead to all of these wild, different interactions between characters. I could go on and on about this, and actually, if you want to hear me go on and on more, I talked with the Concessions folks, Jared and Dan over at Concessions, Consider the Bigger Picture. You can listen to our episode reviewing Anora. We all loved it, and we talk about every aspect of it. But yeah, that's it. Thank you. Have a good day.
Number 17, Drive My Car.
Hi, I'm Matt Schmidt, also known as Wisdom Nugget on Letterboxd. I'd like to talk about Drive My Car, which is, in my opinion, one of the greatest adapted screenplays of all time. It's definitely my favorite. Hamaguchi is able to synthesize multiple, somewhat average short stories from Haruki Murakami's collection Men Without Women, along with a meta-integration of Anton Chekhov's iconic play Uncle Vanya, to create an immensely layered narrative that is near double or even triple the sum of its parts. By stacking these source materials in a kind of stories within a story format, the film is able to effortlessly and poetically tackle themes of love, death, art, forgiveness, and so much more, without feeling like it's trying to do too much. There are jaw-dropping monologues, tear-jerking reveals, and countless subtle nuances delivered across the A-plus ensemble cast. And that's not even talking about the technical aspect. Cinematography, editing, and the score are all of extremely high caliber. It's long and it's sad, but it's an incredibly moving piece of cinema. And isn't that what it's all about? Plus, it has a great late credit sequence and maybe the best incorporation of sign language I've ever seen in film.
Number 16, I Saw the TV Glow.
Hey, this is Aria from the Queer Horror Cult podcast, and I think Jane Schonbrand's I Saw the TV Glow is one of the best films of the decade so far. I'm still struck by how a movie can manage to be simultaneously so emotionally evocative and thoughtful, and yet so ambivalent and agnostic to the point of polarization, with each viewer seeming to take away something completely different from the next. I really love this film's ambivalent use of nostalgia, highlighting both the bitter and the sweet rather than just mourning the loss of some idealized past that never actually existed. I think that growing up, many of us have felt this contradictory push and pull where the same things that we once adored and can look back on fondly can also make us cringe and want to distance ourselves from them. While I Saw the TV Glow is unquestionably a trans narrative, I think the underlying existential horror and dread of feeling unable to fully face who you truly are deep down can resonate with anyone who has ever felt helplessly stuck where they are in life, unable to realize their full potential. When the idea of changing your circumstances feels like jumping headfirst into the unknown and threatens to end your entire life as you know it, it can be painfully easy to fall into complacency and spend years suffocating in slow motion instead. As the film reminds us, there is still time, but whether this message is one of hope remains open to interpretation.
I'm back with our first set of trivia and stats. First up, I'm going to be looking at language and gender breakdowns of the top 50 films. I mostly was polling English language speakers, so the list is predominantly English-based. 34 out of 50 films, or 68%, had English as the film's primary language, with 2 other films that were about equally split between English and another language. The next most common language spoken was French, with 3 films fully in French and 1 that was mostly in French, but also with some German and English too. There are 3 films that are also in Korean, 2 films in German and Japanese, and the only other languages that made the list were Danish, Norwegian, and Telugu. If you thought the English to not English ratio was bad, it's about to get a lot more grim in the gender breakdown. 80% of the top 50 films were directed by male-identifying people, a depressing statistic that aligns mostly with the industry still. There are 9 or 18% female-identifying directors that made the top 50, with surprisingly no repeats, and of course, 1 non-binary person, Jane Schoenbrunn, who directed the number 16 film I Saw the TV Glow. Will this list look different in 5 more years? I hope so. Now, back to our list. Number 15, Pig.
This is Nathan from the I Hope You Suffer podcast, and I'm going to briefly talk about Pig, which is the greatest movie ever made, as everyone knows. It, I think, has Nick Cage's most understated and probably best performance of his career, and I think he also agrees. He talked about it on some talk shows that it's at least in his top 4 movies he feels everyone should see from his career. It's in a extremely sad movie that I believe is entirely about grief, and probably one of the best portrayals of different types of grief that can happen. And it's perfect. It looks gorgeous. The score is incredible. I think everybody should see it if they haven't. It's not the quote-unquote Rage Cage most people assumed it was, especially with it being promoted as John Wick with Nick Cage. It is absolutely not that movie. Features Cage at his least talkative, and like I said, one of his best performances, and it somehow managed to make me a Bruce Springsteen fan with the Cassandra Violet cover of I'm on Fire at the end, which is a hard feat to pull off. So everyone, go watch Pig.
Number 14, Godzilla -1. Godzilla as an entity has existed since 1952, when director Ishihiro Honda wrote a film about the effects of nuclear testing creating a giant lizard that wreaks havoc on Japan. The film was a thoughtful exploration on the fears of nuclear fallout in the aftermath of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings 7 years earlier. As Japan was rebuilding itself back up, the film showed the world their side of things. The franchise has released dozens of films since, eventually going more and more kid-friendly and ridiculous. American versions never quite captured the spirit of Japanese intentions, instead putting more emphasis on the spectacle of giant monsters. Godzilla -1 is probably the second best Godzilla movie ever, only just coming behind the original. The film focuses on the human side of things, on a kamikaze pilot who is too scared to do his duty, allowing an island full of soldiers to die when Godzilla attacks during the war. When he returns to a bombed-out Tokyo, he is ridiculed for having the gall to come back alive when he was supposed to die in action to protect Japan. From there, as he survives only to figure out how to eventually pay back his perceived debts to society, Godzilla returns and only he knows how to take it on. This Godzilla movie, made with a shoestring CGI budget and managed to win an Oscar for Best Visual Effects, putting bloated American films with 10 times the budget to shame in the process. Never would anyone have considered a Godzilla movie having the power to make viewers cry, but watching Shikishima realize being alive is more honorable than dying will make anyone a mess. Number 13, The Worst Person in the World.
What's good, Contra Zoom? This is Todd Pengelly. I am a critic at For Real, and I am here to vouch for Joachim Trier's 2021 masterpiece, The Worst Person in the World, as the best film of the 2020s so far. This film follows a tremendous and multifaceted performance from Renate Reinsve as Julie, a 29-year-old going on 30 who has struggled to find her place in the world, an ever-changing place in the world. And I believe it is the best movie of the decade, or at least my very favorite, because it captures what art is all about. Ethan Hawke once explained that the importance of art is that when you need it, it's there for you. And when your career falls apart, or you fall in love with someone, or fall out of love with someone, or when someone passes sooner than you would have ever thought, it's those moments where you reach out, hoping that you find some sort of representation, some sort of connection, some sort of empathy in the art around you. And I don't think there's a better example of that than The Worst Person in the World. So if you're struggling through your young adulthood, just as Julie is, then this is the movie for you. This is the art that will speak to you, just as it has for me. I love you, Renate Reinsve. I thank you, Joachim Trier, and I could not be more appreciative of The Worst Person in the World, the best film of the 2020s.
Number 12, All Quiet on the Western Front. 2022's All Quiet on the Western Front was the third time the Erich Maria Remarque novel was adapted for the screen, but this was the first time it was made in German by a German director. The book and film show us what it was like to be a soldier in World War I from the German side of things. A controversial subject matter, since they were obviously the bad guys in the Great War. But what makes this story so fascinating is by giving us the perspective of the infantrymen, who are literally teenagers that got swept up in the propaganda and patriotism of serving for your country and signed up to fight and die for Germany, not understanding the consequences. We follow Paul and his school buddies who gleefully enlist and slowly but surely experience the horrors of war, the lack of caring their own superiors had for their lives and well-being, and realization that they might not be fighting for a just cause. The film features breathtaking sequences, including the montage of where new soldiers get their uniforms from, the generals and politicians refusing to negotiate a ceasefire from the comforts of a luxury train car, and of course, the absolutely heartbreaking death that occurs just after the ceasefire was called. This film put Edward Berger on the Hollywood map and rightfully earned the film 4 Oscars, including one for its iconic score. And frankly, I don't care that you think the bwomp bwomp bwomps are annoying, because they give me the chills every time I hear them. Number 11, Dune Part 1.
Hey, this is John from RedCarpetRosters.com, the most comprehensive film awards fantasy site on the net. And straight from the sands of Arrakis, one of my favorite movies of the 2020s is Denis Villeneuve's Dune. It is an epic masterpiece that feels as colossal as the sandworms in the sand. This isn't just a movie, it's an event, and it demands to be experienced on the biggest screen you can find, with the biggest speakers you can find, and Hans Zimmer's thunderous score feels like my DNA is being rearranged. Visually, Dune is nothing short of jaw-dropping. Every frame is a work of art, from the sprawling deserts that stretch endlessly across the screen to the intricate designs of the cities and the interior. It's a feast for the eyes, but Villeneuve doesn't rush. He takes his time, letting you soak in every grain of sand, every ripple of spice in the air. Yeah, it's a slow burn, but hey, that's the point. This is the beginning of a much larger saga, And Villeneuve builds the world meticulously, laying the groundwork for an adaptation that honors Frank Herbert's dense philosophical novel while making it accessible to newcomers. Timothée Chalamet leads the charge with a performance that's as brooding as it is compelling, and the supporting cast, Rebecca Ferguson, Oscar Isaac, Zendaya, Josh Brolin, they add layers of gravitas and intrigue. By the time the credits roll, you're not just watching a story, you're living in it and begging for part 2, which is also absolutely amazing. If you're ready to be immersed in a thoughtful, visually stunning adaptation that's as much about mood as it is about action, Dune is your ticket.
In the first episode, I detailed how the past 5 years have been an unusual batch for the film industry. From COVID postponing or canceling projects entirely, and 2 major union strikes that also caused films to be delayed in both filming and releasing. This would naturally cause the films to be skewed for certain years. Would there also be a recency or anti-recency bias at looking at films from the first eligible year, having given time to grow in appreciation, or forgot completely? Interestingly, the 2 years with the most entries are 2022 and 2023, which is the first full year after COVID lockdowns and the one with the 2 strikes. They both had 14 films appear on the list, or 28% each. The next most popular year was 2021 with 10 films, or 20%, followed by 2024 with 7 films, or 14%, and rounding out the group is 2020 with 5 films, or 10% of the list. What does all this say? I'm still not sure. Now, on to our next film. Number 10, Top Gun Maverick.
What is there to say about Top Gun Maverick other than the fact that it is one of the greatest sequels of all time, arguably superior to the original movie in practically every way? Technologically, it's far more advanced. Director Joseph Kosinski and cinematographer Claudio Miranda take full advantage of the IMAX developments that have occurred between the 1980s and now, making the action sequences far more immersive. Tom Cruise has grown into his signature character with that unstoppable charisma. The supporting cast are very likeable. But above all, it fashions much more empathy for its characters. It's much more emotionally engaging. It's much more suspenseful. It's much funnier than the original movie, and indeed much funnier than most other comedies we've seen lately. So, yeah, an all-round superior sequel.
Number 9, Tar.
This is Bill Antoniou. I write the Classics Shelf for That Shelf, and I host the podcasts Bad Gay Movies and Riviera Rats. Dakota has generously asked me to come on here and talk about Todd Field's Tar, a film that does what all my favorite movies do. It exists very much in a moral gray area. The main character, Lydia Tarr, played in a career-topping performance by Cate Blanchett, is a conductor and composer who has accomplished this dubious and highly unlikely feat of being an EGOT. I would love to know what her Emmy is for. But who also has skeletons in her closet and enemies everywhere, thanks in large part to an affair with a girl who later committed suicide. And as time progresses, Lydia's accomplishments matter less as her personal life gets her in trouble with, at first, the people around her, and then with the public in general. This movie is frequently referred to as taking on cancel culture, but I think what it's really discussing is the struggle, the constant struggle, in this busy online world of maintaining your individuality while also keeping mind of your contribution to society at large. Lydia is superhuman in her work ethic, but does she really need to be that hard on the student at the Juilliard seminar, for instance? And is it possible that only a true monster would be that mean to a kid who is bullying her daughter on the playground? Not that I'm sorry that she does. At the same time, is it also possible that we, as the angry mob, love it when amazing people turn out to be bad? Because then we are released from the burden of being in awe of them and feel better about not having accomplished as much as they have. The fact that this movie never comes up with an answer for all of this and simply treats the rise and fall of this character as a sort of natural inevitability is one of the most admirable qualities of it for me. But I am focusing too much on thematic content and must remember this is a film. Its prime directive is to be entertaining. And for me, it fulfills that as well. The austerity of Florian Hofmeister's cinematography makes every image into a work of art, particularly when we're in her home. And I also loved how much more I discovered about the Dead Girl's appearances with subsequent viewings after the first time. I also love the opening. I think it's so incredible that Todd Field sets the film's pace right from the very beginning by giving us the full credits list, because it's a way to calm our brains down and prepare us for the film's style and rhythm, which it maintains evenly throughout. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about this film. Thank you very much, Dakota, for having me. Thank you all for listening.
Number 8, Killers of the Flower Moon.
Hi, it's Jeff Bulmer from Classic Movies Live and Losing It Over Leo, and I'm here to talk about the 2023 movie Killers of the Flower Moon. As part of my show, I'm in the business of determining which movies will go on to be classics, and I think very few films from the 2020s will stand the test of time better than Killers of the Flower Moon. Everything about this movie is phenomenal. Robert De Niro as maybe the most terrifying man ever put to screen, Leonardo DiCaprio in a career-best performance, Brendan Fraser giving my favorite 2-minute cameo ever, Robbie Robertson brings an incredible score to this, obviously the directing by Martin Scorsese is incredible, and all of it is, of course, anchored by a heartbreaking and rightfully lauded central performance by Lily Gladstone. With Killers of the Flower Moon, Martin Scorsese took his mastery of mob movies and applied it to the biggest mob of them all, the United States government. Yes, obviously the movie is a little more granular than that, but it reminds us that the atrocities of colonization leave lasting scars. The Osage murders weren't even a century ago, and violence against Native people continues to this day. Of course, it's not lost on me that I am a white man talking about violence by white men against Native people. It's not lost on Scorsese either. In the final scenes of this film, the director himself reckons with his role as a passive participant in history, and it's one of the most powerful moments of his career. I think it's not a stretch to say that Scorsese would join me in hoping that by the 2030s we can look back on this decade and acknowledge Indigenous stories as the best of the 2020s. With any luck, we can talk about so many that there isn't even room for Killers of the Flower Moon on that list.
Number 7, Challengers.
Hey Dakota, it's Harper from Hawkeyes and Harper's Holiday Hop. I saw Challengers in theaters 3 times, and every time I gained a deeper appreciation for it. On the surface, it's a fun, sexy, audacious romp, but as you revisit Challengers, there's always more to discover and take away from it. It looks great. If you're ever able to catch it in IMAX, I highly recommend it. You can see all of the sweat and tears so vividly. The world is so well developed, and so are the characters. Not to mention the way that they're expertly played by Zendaya, Mike Faist, and Josh O'Connor, who thread the line between camp and drama so brilliantly. And of course, the score by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross heightens the entire experience. I know it's a pretty recent release, but I've had about 8 months to sit with it now, and it's still definitely one of my top picks for the decade so far.
Number 6, Barbie.
Hey, this is John Richards of RedCarpetRosters.com, the most comprehensive film awards fantasy site on the internet. And one of my favorite movies of the 2020s so far is the pink-powered phenomenon, Barbie. Directed by Greta Gerwig and co-written with her husband, Noah Baumbach, this dazzling masterpiece takes the plastic princess we all know and love and catapults her into a world of heartfelt laughs, existential musings, and eye-popping spectacle. Margot Robbie as Barbie and Ryan Gosling as Ken are absolutely amazing in this. And the cast is absolutely stacked with talent as well. But the real magic is how the filmmakers managed to balance the movie's playful charm with a deeper message about identity, self-worth, and societal expectations. And they did all of that without losing an ounce of fun. And let's talk visuals. The production design team, led by Sarah Greenwood, deserves every standing ovation. Barbie Land is a neon dreamscape that feels like someone brought their childhood toy box to life. Every detail screams creativity and joy, and for heaven's sakes, they caused a pink paint shortage. But here's the kicker. Amidst all the jokes, the dance numbers, and perfectly posed hair flips, there's surprising depth. It's a movie that dares to ask, what does it mean to be enough? And answers with a wink, a laugh, and sometimes a heartfelt sigh. So whether you're here for the laughs, the nostalgia, or, hey, a sparkling existential crisis, Barbie has it all. It's proof that when passionate, talented people come together, they can create a movie as fabulous as a pair of glittery pink heels. And that is why Barbie is one of my favorites of the 2020s.
Looking at the wider list, not just the top 50, seeing what directors appeared on the most ballots. Unlike the Sight and Sound poll I did a few years ago on episode 220, ContraZoom Pod's greatest films of all time, or even looking back on the last full decade on episodes 93 and 94, best films of the decade, there is a much smaller sample size to pull data from, which means even the most prolific directors likely weren't putting out 5 films in the time period. That is also why I've also expanded to the full list, as the top 50 only includes 3 directors with 2 films each. They are Edward Berger for All Quiet on the Western Front and Conclave, Christopher Nolan for Tenet and some other movie that's about to come up in the next segment, and Denis Villeneuve for Dune Part 1 and another surprise for the next segment. Looking at the larger 266 films mentioned on ballots, you have 3 mentions for Luca Guadagnino for Bones and All, Challengers, and Queer, Ryusuke Hamaguchi for Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy, Drive My Car, and Evil Does Not Exist, and Wes Anderson for The French Dispatch, Asteroid City, and one of his shorts, The Wonderful Story of Henry Sugar. Plenty of other directors got 2 films mentioned, and I won't name them all or their films, but some of those directors include Jane Schoenbrunn, Steven Spielberg, Todd Haynes, Emerald Fennell, Hirokazu Koreeda, Rose Glass, and Kelly Reichardt, among many more. One last interesting statistic is how our voters feel about the Cronenberg family. Son Brandon had Possessor make the list, but also got votes for Infinity Pool, while father David had Crimes of the Future get votes, and daughter Caitlin had her debut film Humane appear on 1 ballot, showing what a bright future body horror still has. Now, for our top 5. Number 5, The Zone of Interest. The Zone of Interest has been referred to as a film that delves into the banality of evil, and is such a perfect description for Jonathan Glazer's film. We watch the day-to-day life of a concentration camp attendant and his family. Rudolf Haas brings home gifts for his wife, he takes business meetings from industry leaders, and is forced to talk about dreaded KPIs to his superiors. Except the gifts he brings home are stolen clothing and jewelry from prisoners. The meetings are about building more efficient gas chambers, and the KPIs are about how many people are being killed under his watch. We never see the concentration camp directly, but the home the family lives in borders the wall, so we frequently hear trains arriving, screams followed by gunshots, and of course, the gas chambers chugging along. Everything we don't see is all the more scary as we know exactly what it all means. Glazer heightens the film by including infrared sequences of a townsfolk who hides food for the prisoners. The screen turning bright red and an ending that breaks the fourth wall, showing us the casualties of the camps. Germany, a country that has fought hard to rehab its image and re-educate its citizens, even allowed Glazer to make the movie next to a real concentration camp. The Zone of Interest easily could have been offensive, insensitive, and inappropriate, but instead is a thought-provoking masterpiece, giving viewers a new angle to understand the scope of what occurred. Number 4, Past Lives.
Hey Dakota, this is Matthew Simpson from the Awesome Friday podcast. I'm here to speak a little bit about Past Lives, the 2023 film written and directed by Celine Song, starring Greta Lee, Teo Yu, and John Magaro. The film follows Greta Lee's Nora, a young woman who leaves Korea for America for school as a child, and later reconnects with Hae Sung, played by Yu, a childhood friend, later in New York. The film is a beautiful, heartbreaking examination of the choices we make in life, the relationships we have and don't have, and a lament for the roads not taken, anchored by an incredibly honest and vulnerable performances by Lee and Yu. The film speaks about who we love, how we love them, why we love them, and those we missed the opportunity to love the way that we wanted. It's gorgeous, human, relatable, emotionally shattering, and easily my favorite movie of 2023.
Number 3, Dune Part 2.
I have a theory that because Denis Villeneuve chose to split Dune into 2 parts, neither really gets their proper due because they both feel like parts of a whole rather than 2 distinctive films. But what he achieves in these movies is nothing short of extraordinary, in my opinion. The source material is really dense, and as we've seen from other projects, it's really difficult to adapt. And Denis not only adapts the visuals of Frank Herbert with such a stunning touch, but he even course corrects the story, especially in Part 2, to really push forward Herbert's true intentions for the story of Paul Atreides. It's one of the only movies this year I felt truly all-consumed by. It was like every other person in the audience, the theater itself, it all just melted away. And, Dune, it's a space epic, and Denis translated that beautifully in the way that only Denis Villeneuve knows how. And I think it is such an achievement of film, and it is certainly, I think, one of the best films of this decade, along with Part 1.
Number 2, Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Hi, Dakota. Thanks for having me on the show. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nate Storing, and I'm a co-host of the Springfield Googleplex podcast, which is also brought to you by That Shelf. And it's the podcast where every other week we dissect a movie parodied on The Simpsons. So for my picks of the 2020s so far, I put 2022's Everything Everywhere All at Once as my number 2 selection overall, right behind Tar, if you're curious. But, I know it might be kind of a normie pick, considering it won Best Picture at the Oscars that year, but here are the 3 reasons why it made my list. So, number 1, it's the definitive multiverse movie, in my opinion. At a time when the Marvel Cinematic Universe has spent nearly a decade sloppily tromping its way into the multiverse, this movie absolutely ate its lunch. It shows the full visual and storytelling potential of the multiverse better even than a show than Loki. It mashes up direct parodies of movies like Ratatouille with familiar tropes from a wide range of movie genres, with stuff you've never seen before on film, like 2 middle-aged women with hot dog fingers falling in love. Number 2, it's beautiful. The production design is inventive, blending mundane sets with more genre parodies and outright fantasy. The special effects feel really tactile and like a natural extension of that production design. It also integrates this really great mixed media aesthetic that fits perfectly with the whole multiverse theme. The bottom line is that there just aren't that many movies out there these days that create a new piece of imagery that's as iconic as Elliot and E.T. riding their bikes across a giant moon. But I think the googly eye on Michelle Yeoh's forehead is one of those images, in my opinion. And then lastly, this movie's accessible, right? Look, some people have criticized this movie for being broad in its comedy and its emotionality, but for me, the performances always keep it really grounded front to back. You have a touching, funny, and physically demanding lead performance from Michelle Yeoh. You have the return to prominence of the ever-charming Ke Huy Quan. You have Jamie Lee Curtis as a tax adjuster you love to hate, and of course, Stephanie Hsu playing a villain that's equal parts camp and tragedy. So all in all, this movie brings together the best elements of a crowd-pleasing action sci-fi romp, which is right up my alley, with the kind of dramatic heft that you really expect from a Best Picture winner. And altogether, it's just a unique and memorable package.
Number 1, Oppenheimer. Honestly, what could be said about Oppenheimer that hasn't already been said a million times? Christopher Nolan has been the biggest director in the world for the last 20 years, and was a perfect storm for his 2023 magnum opus. Using the book American Prometheus to write a screenplay about the life of Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, was ripe for excellence. The film allowed Nolan to use his trademark nonlinear storytelling to show us the lead up to the creation, America using his findings to bomb Japan twice, and the aftermath, including a Senate confirmation hearing for the man who oversaw the project, showing us the fallout. The film gave regular Nolan performer Cillian Murphy his first lead role in a major Hollywood production after years of being a great supporting player. He also managed to assemble quite possibly the most stacked cast ever with Emily Blunt, Florence Pugh, Robert Downey Jr., Matt Damon, Kenneth Branagh, Gary Oldman, Josh Hartnett, David Krumholtz, Matthew Modine, David Dastmalchian, Jack Quaid, Benny Safdie, Rami Malek, Casey Affleck, and many more people, causing every scene to be stacked to the gills. Of course, in typical Nolan fashion, for the famous Trinity bomb test sequence, he opted to have his team build a real bomb to blow up instead of CGIing it. And frankly, we as viewers were rewarded for it. Nolan finally won Best Picture and Best Director after previously missing out on Oscar nominations for films like Dunkirk, Inception, and Memento. Every single department is on top of their game, from production design, costume, score, editing, cinematography, hair and makeup, acting, and more. It's a monumental feat of filmmaking that likely won't be matched anytime soon. Sure, the movie had help with the marketing, coming out the same day as Barbie and causing the Barbenheimer phenomenon that studios have tried relentlessly to recreate with pairings like Glicked and Nosfergirl. It's a 3-hour masterpiece that is easily rewatchable, that delves into the psyche of humanity and the consequences of our actions. Oppenheimer appeared on 61% of ballots submitted and had 55 more points over our second-place film, making this a landslide of epic proportions. There was never any doubt that Oppenheimer was the best film of the decade so far, and in 5 years, it will likely be in conversation for best film of the decade too. This concludes our Best Films of the Decade So Far series. I really hope you enjoyed these episodes. If you're new here, please subscribe to our show wherever you listen to podcasts, and if you can rate us 5 stars and review the show, it will really help us grow and find new listeners. We are about to head into Oscar season, so if you like that kind of thing, the next few months' worth of episodes will be focused on that subject. I want to give a huge thank you to the following people for sending in voicemails praising films they had high on their ballots. Callum McNabb from the Scare Traducing Podcast, Brian Loomis from the What a Picture Podcast, Brody Cottenham, screenwriter and ContraZoomPod.com contributor, Daniel Grant from the Spoiled Rotten Podcast, Matthew Simpson from the Awesome Friday Podcast, Alex Watson from AW Movie Squawk and ContraZoomPod.com contributor, Martin Strange from the Filmsplaining Podcast, Matt Schmidt, filmmaker, Aria from the Queer Horror Cult Podcast, Nathan Sizemore from the I Hope You Suffer Podcast, Todd Pengelly, critic for For Real, John Richards from Red Carpet Rosters, Sean Wilson, author of The Sound of Cinema, Bill Antoniou from the Bad Gay Movies and Riviera Rats podcasts, Jeff Ballmer from Classic Movies Live and ContraZoomPod.com contributor, Harper Thompson from Harper's Holiday Hop, Rachel Ho, film editor at Exclaim magazine and former co-host of ContraZoom, and Nate Storing from the Springfield Googleplex podcast. I also want to give a very big thank you to Crystal Tapia for designing very special artwork for this series. This has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. Follow the show on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at ContraZoomPod. What were your favorite films of the decade so far? Leave a comment on Spotify or send us an email. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. And if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.